All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this 21st episode of When the Heart Leads. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, founder of Books of Eden Publishing, and I am ecstatic to be with you all today. If you just tuned in, this is kind of take two because I'm troubleshooting my internet a little bit, so I'm hoping that this one will go through. So we're just going to go all the way through regardless. So welcome to this 21st episode. In some ways, I feel like I was saying, I feel a little bit like I'm speaking from kind of far away, as though the kind of there's a lot of space between us. And I think part of that is the context for this episode, which is entitled Resting. And in this episode, I'm really going to look at the qualities of rest, of true rest, and how that's necessary for the process of creation. And one of the reasons I keep talking about the process of creation is that in these past few weeks, since the last time I recorded a podcast, it's just felt like there's been a lot of activation and a lot of shedding. And as I was saying, that feels a little bit like the theme of this year so far, this shedding, this really deep shedding. And I think part of that is because those of us who are really called to create a new way of being on Earth, a new way of being in humanity, we're getting down to those levels of deepest discernment between what truly is the dreams and the desires of our heart, what truly is the calling of our soul, and what is something that may have been layered on top of that, no matter how noble or familiar. And a lot of this has to do with examining what is familiar and discerning, is this simply familiar because it's been a reoccurring pattern, or is this familiar in the sense of it's familiar because it's a soul calling? And so I'm going to talk today about the role of rest in this process. And it feels in some ways like the context of the earth is even helping with this. Where I live in Colorado, it's been a little bit cold. It's been a little bit rainy. After some beautiful long days of sunshine, we've got a few days of rain. And so it really does feel like it's calling back into that kind of cozy place with the rain falling outside. So this is a beautiful context for really exploring the idea of rest. And so I want to talk a little bit about maybe a new frame or a deeper frame of the idea of rest to start. So first of all, it's very, very important for us to integrate rest into our lives, especially when we're working on creating something completely new that might feel incredibly sometimes daunting or unprecedented in our lives, and possibly even in the world, right? That's the level we're talking about here, that kind of threshold. And it's this period of rest, right? It's different from, there's two things I want to draw a distinction. So it's very different from collapsing from exhaustion, although that might be what gets you there. So just to go into that for a moment, especially when I used to be an elite athlete, and I think for a long time I kind of had two, and I've mentioned this before, but I kind of had two modes of operating, and one was 100% on, and the other was hitting a wall and being completely exhausted. And I equated that kind of that exhaustion with rest, and that's not exactly what I'm talking about here, right? Ideally, we're going to be tuning in this new way of being, which is so connected to our own internal rhythms, the rhythms of our body, the rhythms of the earth, right? Ideally, we're going to be so connected that we don't need to hit that wall, that kind of critical place of exhaustion and depletion in order to understand that we need rest, right? So we're going to be much more in tune to those subtle energies. So it's not ideally that place of complete exhaustion. And it's also not, and this is important as well, it's also not the same thing as waiting. So in these processes of creation, of course, there will be times when nothing really seems to be happening. And in some ways, for me, as well, I have been called impulsive, but I like to refer to myself as a woman of action. But as a kind of someone who really likes to kind of jump into action or spring into action, right? These periods of time when not a lot seems to be happening can be difficult for me. And it's been a really powerful learning to sink into those times and really see them not as a waste or as a just something to be got through, but actually as a necessary part of this process of creation. And so, but this rest, it's different from waiting. And I've definitely been in that place where I didn't know what my next step was, and I didn't know how to move forward, and I was just kind of waiting. And that's a really tough place to be, right? But the quality of rest I'm talking about is very different from that. It's actually a deeply generative state of being. And if you think about, for instance, if you think about sleeping, like that really, really good sleep, right? There's a lot happening in that time. There's restoration of cells, of brain cells, digestion, right? All these things, these internal unconscious processes are taking over. And they're all good, right? They're all positive. They're all healthy. They're all contributing to your vitality, right? And it's that quality I want to tune into for this idea of rest when we're in the process of deep and powerful and unprecedented creation in our lives. So, one of the reasons this came up specifically today is that, as you may know, I'm writing my third book, and I've been so immersed in that process, and I've had incredible miracles come into my life to allow me to really, really focus on that process of creating this book. And the book itself is unfolding as a guide to the principles of creation. And this is different from something like manifesting or materialization, which are both important, right? But this is the tuning into our own, as humans, as divine beings, our own capacity for unprecedented creation, right? Whereas something like, I think of something like materialization or manifestation as bringing to you something that's already in the field, and that's very cool and very important, and we all need that. But I'm talking about something a little bit deeper, where we're really bringing forth something that has never been seen before, right? And so I've been immersed in writing this book, and every day I wake up and I meditate and I go into writing, and what's emerging is very unexpected. But today I woke up and I just couldn't go into that space of the book. I needed a break. And there's a part of me that sees progress as something that is visible, tangible, right? There's a part of me that resisted that a little bit and said, well, then you won't make any more progress on your book. And I began to really think about this idea of just taking a break from it and what happens in that space. And there's something really important about that. Like there's like a natural tug that occurs. Like it's not a resistance. It's not a rejection of the book or anything like that. It's just this natural tug of like, it's just time for a break. It's time to let it all down. It's time to put it all down. Right. And I think a lot of times this happens in a moment before a really, really big revelation or epiphany occurs. And instead of, and in the last podcast, we talked about that moment of reframing where suddenly things shifted into place in a new way, right? And I think a lot of times this period of rest precedes that really powerful reframing, very powerful revelation. And so it was just a very strong nudge to say, it's okay. You can put it down. In fact, that's what you're being called to do right now. And so I began really thinking about this. And So there's a few different threads I'm going to be pulling together in this podcast episode. And so that's the framing of the idea of rest, right? It's different from exhaustion. It's different from waiting. It's actually a very generative state that allows kind of this deep integration of everything that's come through. And in a little bit in the episode, I'm going to talk about one of the paths of shamanism that I followed, that really, one of the biggest things that I've discovered in that is that something isn't really real for me until it's fully embodied, until it comes all the way into my being. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but that's just a little nudge. So anyway, so we talked about rest. And the other day I had this idea of maybe what's going to be coming forward from there. And what I discovered, it was after this really powerful kind of somatic experience. And I work with a woman who does incredible somatic work, which is, again, like I was saying, bringing understanding into the body itself. And after that session, where it was a big release of kind of what you could call survival energy, and this invitation in of a more expansive, restful, secure energy, I just kind of went and laid down on the ground, like kind of face down on the grass. And I had a thought that was kind of new to me. And that thought was what if I just did what I enjoyed? Okay, and in some ways, this is like what we've been getting at the entire duration of this podcast, which has been almost, close to a year now. But for me, this felt suddenly like I experienced this thought in a new way. And I realized how often, which is almost constantly, actually, I think about, I think about it as the idea of so that. I do something so that this can happen. I do this so that that can happen. This happens so that this, so that this, so that this, right? And the idea is that that so that, right, takes an immense amount of energy, right? And the other thing about the so that, right? So I'm talking about the so that, but kind of having a goal outside of the action itself, right? It also implies kind of a linear or predictable chain of events. I will do this so that that can happen, so that that can happen, so that that can happen. And sometimes this is really, sometimes this is just fine, just operating that way. Like I will clean the house so that it's clean, right? Or so that I feel better, whatever. Sometimes that's a really appropriate response. But in this process, this deep process of creation, right? This larger context of creation, the idea of so that begins to kind of dissolve out, right? And when we're moving into this space of heart creation, which is really what I'm talking about, and I believe that was second or third episode I talked about heart creation, and got much more into what that is. But when we're in this process of heart creation, which is bringing forward something completely unprecedented in our lives and in the world, right? That realm of so that eventually needs to dissolve away, because what we're entering into in this place really is a realm of miracles. And one of the most powerful qualities of this realm is that everything is it's immediately present in your own way of being. And so by that, I mean, we're moving into a place where the linear process of creation is going to become less and less fulfilling. And so when we're kind of in this place of, what if I just did something because I love doing it, right? And that's the so that. It collapses that idea of this, then this, then this. Because what's happening is you're just moving into that space of living in that way that is most fulfilling all the time. And this is different. I want to say this is different from like self-indulgence or different from hedonism, right? It's a very different energy, right? Because the arising of the heart's dream is going to be trustworthy in the sense that it benefits not just you, but all beings, right? So the heart, we talked about this, is interconnected with all beings. It just is, right? That's the nature of it. Whether or not we acknowledge those connections is another thing, but the nature of the heart is connection, right? So when actions arise from that place of pure love, like what would it be to create something beautiful just because, and not because you think it's going to enhance your career, give you more prestige, support you, right? Like all these outside things, right? But just creating from the pure, unadulterated joy of it, right? That's kind of where we're moving into. When you do that, so that has already collapsed into it. I'm doing this because I love it. I'm doing this because I'm doing it, right? But trusting that as a way of being is has been a very new thought for me. So all right. So in some ways, like I said, I feel like I'm a little bit far away speaking all of this. And one of the reasons for that is that I'm in some ways the embodiment of it. And as I'm speaking, I'm finding words for all these things that are coming in. So we've got this idea of heart creation, and we've got this idea of rest, and rest being a necessary part of that, right? And then that quality of rest being very generative and very nourishing, right? So the rest is part of that arising of the heart creation. Like, this would just feel really good right now. So I'm going to do that. And then from there, new revelations can come in. It's a fine line, because it feels like there is a so that, like I'm resting so that revelations can come in. But there's no seeking that out. It's just allowing that inner tug to arise. So I'm going to pivot just a little bit into something that's related to all of this. I want to talk for a moment about the ego. And something I've been coming to understand about the ego as well. And this choosing joy, this choosing to turn toward the nudges, the tugs, the intuition of the heart, that's going to draw you more and more into what is deeply fulfilling, right? Again, not the indulgence or the hedonism, or you could say there's nothing hedonistic or indulgent or even lazy about this quality of rest, right? Or quality of heart creation. It's like a vital joy that emerges when we turn toward it. That's going to begin to naturally dissolve the tendencies of the ego. And I want to talk a little bit about this because this is an immense topic, and I think most likely I'll have an entire podcast episode about it. But I wanted to weave it in here a little bit because more and more and more, I keep coming across what I see as really detrimental misconceptions of the ego. What I see as, and again, take what resonates, leave what doesn't. But I think this is really important for those of us who are ready to move beyond kind of an antagonistic stance toward the ego. I want to offer something else for us that I found a much gentler way and more powerful way to work with these tendencies of our wounds. So I see the ego as so this kind of came about. I had a friend who a while back, she told me how she went to this kind of shamanic ceremony, and her intention was to completely burn away her ego. I remember hearing that and thinking, oh, I bet that didn't go well for you. And it didn't. And she had this incredible backlash from it and was just like in a state of very kind of swirling tumult and confusion. And the reason for that I see is the ego itself is not something to be reviled. right? Especially in a lot of spiritual cultures or spiritual traditions or spiritual communities, right? We see the ego as something to be overcome, to be conquered, to be killed, right? But if you think about it, these are all words of the ego itself, right? Of the wounded ego, you could say. I see the ego as simply our capacity for self-reference. So one of the things that sets humans apart is that we have this capacity for self-reflection, self-reference, self-knowledge. And if we go all the way back to even the Oracle of Delphi, right? Know thyself. That is impossible without the ego. Right? What's happened with the ego is that it's become layered over with things like judgment and fear. And it's been in our wounding, right? That capacity for self-reference, we turn it against ourselves. Right? And I promise I'm going to tie this back into rest and heart creation and all that. Just let's roll with this for a second. But what I really discovered is that when we honor that capacity for self-reference, right, what that allows in humans, what that allows in us is to, it really allows for the divine emanation of self-love, right, in a really conscious way. So when we talk about the ego, right, there's no need to fight it. There's no need to conquer it. There's no need to dissolve it. There's no need to get rid of it. Right? What is being called for is instead this, not a rejection, but a cleansing of our own perception. And that cleansing happens through compassion for the self, deep, powerful flow of love and compassion. That cleansing happens through joy. Through choosing joy, through choosing things that bring us joy, right? And sometimes I find those are kind of, in some ways, my two most reliable responses to whatever's happening in my life. If something seems really hard, I move into compassion, right? If I feel like I'm in a place of stability, I can move into a place of joy, right? And either one of those things begins to dissolve out the layers that have the layers of conditioning that have kind of crystallized around the ego or atrophied around the ego, which is simply our capacity for self-reflection. So as we move out of this old way of consciousness, and I'm about to read something in my book that kind of allows that to crystallize and to frame. But as we move out of that, we're gonna move entirely out of that feeling like we need to conquer, compete, kill, burn away, resist, right? All of that. That's all actually perpetuations of the wounded ego itself, right? So the way that we dissolve that kind of suffering is to begin to turn toward compassion, to allow the ego in its purest form, to allow us to turn toward and perceive ourselves, but to perceive it cleansed through a lens that has been cleansed of judgment and cruelty and self-recrimination, but to simply see clearly ourselves as love, as divine emanations. And in that way, right, the ego, which just is our capacity for self-reference, suddenly becomes an absolute superpower that we can harness in the act of conscious creation, which is kind of what this is about. So I've got this thread of rest. I've got this thread of heart creation. Now I've got this thread of cleansing the ego. So we don't have to put more energy into fighting the ego, right? We just keep doing this thing where we follow our heart, choose joy, choose compassion. The ego, the conditions around the ego dissolve entirely, and it simply becomes what it is in its purest form. So, I'd like to read a couple of passages from my book. So I've written 2 books. So the one we're looking at today is The New Eden, Paradise Retold. And if you're following along, we're going to start on page 55. And if you don't have the book, you can just listen, sit back and listen. But sometimes I use these books as oracles, and I really felt the need for that today. And so I was drawn to this one, the blue book. And when I opened it, it was to a passage that seemed really representative of what I'm talking about in this episode. All right, and what this passage is going to do is it's going to create some larger context for all this stuff that I'm talking about. Heart creation, the need for rest as a part of that, the dissolution of the ego through compassion, through love, right? Harnessing that. And I want to talk a little bit here about the larger world context that's happening. And then that's going to lead me into talking about a little bit about embodiment. So just sit back and come along for the ride here. So I'm just going to read this. So this is the at the top of 55. The section is called Self and World. Right? And I wrote, those of us awakening to our inner divinity are finding it increasingly difficult to live and work within systems that currently run our world. These systems no longer reflect our understanding of who we are. They no longer reflect or uphold the level of consciousness that we, as forerunners of the new era, have stepped into. The prevailing systems on our planet can no longer support the expansion that humanity is undergoing. Right, so just very quickly, when I'm talking about things like heart creation, I'm talking about things like creating unprecedented ways of being, right? This is why, right? This is some of the context around it. The systems, the structures that we've created came from a lower level of consciousness, right? And those of us who are expanding out of that consciousness, we don't feel like we fit or can be nourished or held or supported in those systems because we're expanding beyond them. All right. I really, really want to allow that to be something that is spoken and supported, right? That there's not something wrong with you because you're no longer nourished or supported or held within the systems that seem to used to work, right? It's actually a good thing because it shows that you're expanding beyond it, all right? Which means that we are way shores, which is where this heart creation comes from. So I wrote, I'm skipping down a little bit. I'm still on page 55, but a little ways down, I said, those of us who have experienced the great change, like in this book, I call it the great change, which is essentially that shift that happens from operating in a rational, linear way to operating from the expansive infinity of the heart, right? The infinite creativity of the heart. Those of us who have experienced the great change within ourselves have already come or are rapidly coming to embody the new consciousness. We stand, therefore, at the threshold, at the hinge of this transition, right? And I feel a lot of us are really standing there right now at that threshold, that hinge of transition, as I said. So we can do this, right? We can move into this new way of being. We can create these pathways because we have undergone the transition ourselves on a personal level, right? So all the personal things you're experiencing around perhaps dissatisfaction, things not working anymore, right? That's all part of this larger, you're kind of a point of consciousness for this larger expansion that's happening in humanity, right? It's just some of us who are going first, right? So we, as such, right, because we have undergone this transition on a personal level, we understand the process intimately. With our embodied wisdom, we have already begun breaking trail, creating a bridge for others to follow into the realm of the heart. We understand, because we experienced it, that the mind is not the mechanism through which these new systems will develop, as the mind, which, with its assumption of duality, is the very instrument that we are transcending. and then kind of this is kind of the main thesis of the book itself. I said the majority of organizations and the network of our global systems were formed at a previous level of evolution upon a set of assumptions that are no longer relevant or true. The systems currently in place emerged from humanity's need for survival. They were founded on assumptions of scarcity, lack, mistrust, right? So I'm skipping ahead here. As we awaken to our innate divinity and unlimited capacity to command miracles, we will no longer relate to a world run by these assumptions of fear and lack. We will no longer consider survival as the ultimate goal of life. In the coming Eden, we will break away from evolutionary models designed purely for survival and create instead models designed for thriving. We ask a new question. What would the world look like if it was ordered for thriving? All right, so I'm going to pause there. That was a lot. What I'm kind of getting at here, right, is that we are very deeply moving into this level of heart creation, which means that all of the tendrils, the threads, no matter how slim, no matter how almost invisible, that have emerged from this old evolutionary consciousness, right? This old consciousness of surviving, right? And there's so much more to say about that. But what we're really being called to do, those of us who are way showers, who are committed who are devoted to bringing forward a new way of being, right? A way of being based on thriving, on heart creation, right? What's happening right now is the deepest dissolution of any instinct, any way of being, any thought form, any piece of conditioning that has anything to do with survival. And those are driven by this wounded ego, right? So what's happening at this threshold is that ideas of something like thriving. So we might have an idea of what thriving is, right? That's going to start to become embodied in our very presence, in our bodies, in our being, in our knowing, right? And so it becomes a way that we live and not just a theory or a concept. And we're being called to fully step into that embodiment of thriving. And to come all the way back, the immensity of this shift is going to require rest, right? It's going to require that we take time away from the constant conscious processing, thinking, and allow for the processes of generation and embodiment to take over, right? So if we're tired or suddenly we're feeling a shift away from that whatever this creation is, right? Or this creation that's calling us. And we've been so focused on that. And suddenly there's a time when that's just not available to us. And we'll know that inner tug, right? It's important to really trust that, because what's happening, I believe, at these times is a very powerful embodiment of the essence of the creation that we're bringing through, to allow for its next phase, its next revelation, its next message to come in, right? And so it's an immense shift. It's going to require rest, right? This quality of rest is not exhaustion. It's not waiting. It's a generative restoration and preparation for the next revelation that's coming in, right? And so this way, and what ultimately begins to happen is that this way of creation becomes the goal itself. So that's where the so that, right? The so that, which is the purview often of the ego, right? The wounded ego, I should say. That just gets collapsed in on itself. And we find ourselves lying face down on the grass saying, What if I just did things because I enjoyed them? And what if that was enough? Right? And what if that was enough? Right? This is the kind of I'm not even going to say revolutionary, because that implies a circle, right? Coming back. I think we're popping up into a whole different level of being, right? An evolutionary leap that we're jumping into, right? And even that question of, what if I did what I loved? What if I did what my heart called me to do and that was enough, right? What if I created simply because it brought me joy? And what if that was enough? Right? And suddenly all those fears of survival and lack and scarcity dissolve in the face of that. Right? This is a truly unprecedented concept in our kind of mainstream consciousness right now. Right? And this is kind of the question, the idea that I'm bringing forward as a possibility right now. And so the way that this joy, this creation materializes, the way of it is also the goal of it. Right? Because as we live in thriving, as we become embodied in thriving, right? All the actions and steps that arise from our heart are instantly, automatically nourishing, compassionate, loving, creating vitality in and of itself, without a step so that you can get somewhere else, right? So, this is what I call, this is the whole ball for today's talk. So we've got a couple different threads here, right? We've got this, whichever one or all of them or however they come together for you, trust what's emerging right now as the thing that's most relevant for you right now. Whether it's this idea of rest, this idea of compassion and love dissolving the conditions of the ego so that all that's left is a clear and loving reference of self, knowledge of self, right? How that knowledge of self brings forward the deep creations of the heart and soul, how those deep creations of the heart and soul are enough, right? And how it's okay to feel like you're not really held or nourished or drawn to the prevailing systems and structures of the world, because those were created at a level of consciousness that you're expanding out of, right? So all that stuff coming together. And so what are we expanding into, right? That's this leap that the rest, the time of integration, is going to allow us to take, right? That's the threshold that's appearing before us as we allow all this other stuff to integrate. So that was a lot. So what I'm going to say as like just a practice is maybe allow this idea of rest to emerge for you, right? And maybe that means sleeping. Right? Maybe that means lying on the grass. Maybe it means switching up your routine, going somewhere, trying something new, sinking your hands in the dirt. Whatever it is, do something just because it brings you joy. And then see what emerges from there. When you're just fully in that moment, see what emerges. I'm going to do this too. I think I'm saying this for myself as well. Right? So if you've been so focused on creating something, and you're feeling like maybe, woof, you just need a break, really trust that. Not as an aberration, not as a gap, not as a step backwards, but as a necessary part of the creation itself, right? Resting. All right. So I think I touched on a lot of topics in here that are going to continue to come back through as I, as I tune in more and more with you all. There's a lot of big things in here around what it means to engage with the ego from a place of love, right? What it means to step out of the old systems that have held us, not from a place of resistance, but just from a place of we've outgrown them, right? We've outgrown them. What does that mean, right? A lot of that stuff's going to come up again and again. But right now, hopefully this episode number 21, resting, hopefully it was nourishing for you. Hopefully you got something from it that allowed something to just land in a new way, right? That allows you to come to rest in a new way. So, this has been the 21st episode of When the Heart Leads, Resting. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, founder of Books of Eden Publishing, author of 2 books, The New Eden, Paradise Retold, and Finding Home, a mystical memoir, soon to be the author of 3 books, as I'm working on this third one that's emerging step by step and requiring some rest in the interim. If you'd like to learn more about my work, you can visit my website, booksofeden.com. And you can subscribe to the newsletter, which I send out every once in a while, mostly just for updates. I will never spam you. And you could also follow this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I jump in once every few weeks with some new ideas. So it's been so wonderful to connect with you across time and space. From my heart to yours, till next time.